When people talk about the 100 Years' War, you probably imagine an endless, century-long battle between England and France. But here's the thing. It wasn't really a single war at all. In fact, for much of those 100 years, there wasn't much actual fighting. So why did it last so long? And why, despite England winning most of the battles, did they still lose? It all started in 1328. France had a problem. King Charles IV had died without a direct male heir. So who should inherit? The French nobility had two choices. One was Philip, the dead king's cousin. The other, Edward III of England, who, inconveniently, was the dead king's nephew, but through his mother, Queen Isabella. Now, in England, that wasn't a problem. But in France, they had this thing called Salic law, which said the crown couldn't pass through a woman. The French nobility had no interest in being ruled by an Englishman, let alone one whose mother, alongside her lover, was suspected of killing the previous king, Edward II. So, the French told Edward to get lost, and crowned Philip instead. Problem solved, right? In 1337, Philip did something that at the time seemed like a fairly routine bit of medieval politics. He confiscated a chunk of land in France that belonged to Edward. Now, this wasn't just any land. It was a Duchy of Aquitaine, a wealthy region that had been under English control for generations. And Philip had a perfectly good reason, at least from his point of view. Edward, his vassal, had been refusing to do the one thing vassals were supposed to do: show up, bend the knee, and swear loyalty. But Edward was no ordinary vassal. He was also a king in his own right, and he wasn't about to let some French monarch push him around. Instead of just accepting the loss, he did something that would set Europe on fire for over a century. He declared himself the rightful king of France. And once you've claimed the throne of the most powerful kingdom in Europe, you can't exactly take it back. So, in 1340, Edward had himself crowned King of France, while still being King of England. And since there wasn't room for two kings on one throne, there was only one way to settle it: war. Edward set sail for France in 1340, and met the French navy off the coast of Flanders at the Battle of Sluys. The English forces were heavily outnumbered, but had a secret weapon: the longbow. Arrows rained down on the French sailors, and the French navy was decimated. Victory gave the English control of the Channel, and for the rest of the war, the English kings could launch an invasion whenever and wherever they liked. Now, in keeping with the rest of the war, nothing really happens for a few years, war being expensive and all that. In 1346, Edward launches another invasion, landing at Normandy with 15,000 men. His plan? A classic medieval smash and grab. Raid French towns, steal everything that isn't nailed down, and then march south to link up with English allies. Simple enough, right? Well, when Philip hears of this, he gathers an army over twice the size of Edward's, and they eventually meet at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. As with the Battle of Sluys, English longbowmen once again destroy the French, and a decisive battle is won. The war would be put on hold for a few years, thanks to the Black Death. By 1356, England had recovered, both physically and financially, and Edward's son, the Black Prince, has a plan. He's leading a small English army through France, doing what the English do best: raiding, burning towns, and generally making life miserable for the French. He's heading north, thinking he can link up with his father's forces. Simple plan. But there's one problem. King John II of France, Philip's son, has raised a massive army, maybe 15,000 or more men, to stop him. He corners Edward's troops near Poitiers and launches a massive cavalry charge. But then, out of nowhere, they are met, once again, by a hail of arrows from the English longbowmen. The French counterattack until they are surprised again, this time by an English cavalry charge. The result? Disaster for the French, and King John is captured. In 1371, Edward the Black Prince returned to England but was in poor health. He died in 1376, while his father the king died the following year. Civil unrest in both England and France, mainly caused by taxation in order to pay for the ongoing war, put hostilities on hold. By 1415, King Henry V decides he wants to be King of France and invades. After laying siege to the town of Harfleur and securing its surrender, he decides to march towards the English-controlled port of Calais. But the French army are not far behind, and they meet with the heavily outnumbered English army at Agincourt, where once again they are massacred by the longbowmen. Almost 40% of the French nobility is killed. Now, normally when one side keeps winning battles, the war ends. But here's where things take a turn. The English had a secret weapon, the longbow. French knights in heavy armor, no match. In battles like Crécy, Poitiers, and later Agincourt, England's small, well-trained forces crushed massive French armies. By the early 1400s, England controlled nearly half of France. Looks like the war's over, right? But war isn't just about battles. France had something England didn't: sheer numbers and a deeper treasury. The longer the war dragged on, the harder it was for England to hold on to its conquests. It's 1429, and things are not looking good for France. The English, thanks to their usual strategy, longbows, cavalry, and picking fights they probably shouldn't win, are in control of vast areas of the country. Even worse, the French king, Charles VII, is barely holding on to his throne. Half of France doesn't even recognize him as king. The war, which has been dragging on for nearly a century, seems like it's heading towards an inevitable English victory. But then, along comes Joan of Arc. Now, if you were to predict who would turn the war around, a teenage peasant girl from a small village wouldn't exactly be at the top of your list. But Joan isn't just any peasant. She claims she's been hearing voices, from saints no less, telling her that God has chosen her to drive the English out and put Charles VII on the throne. Old claim. And amazingly, Charles agrees to give her a shot. Joan, dressed in armor, carrying a banner, rides to Orléans, the last major city standing between the English and complete domination of central France. And what happens next changes everything. At this point, the English have Orléans surrounded. For once, they have the upper hand. The French defenders are demoralized, low on supplies, and ready to surrender. The English? They assume it's just a matter of time before the city falls. After all, a few months earlier, they'd been steamrolling the French in battle after battle. But then Joan arrives. She doesn't come with reinforcements. She doesn't have a secret superweapon. What she brings is something even more powerful: morale. The French troops, who are about to give up, suddenly believe they can win. They see her as a sign that God is on their side. Instead of surrendering, they attack. And over the next several days, Joan leads the charge, literally. She urges her troops forward, pushes for aggressive assaults on English fortifications, and at one point, even takes an arrow to the shoulder and keeps fighting. And incredibly, it works. The English suddenly find themselves losing ground. One by one, their positions fall. And just like that, on May the 8th, 1429, the English are forced to retreat. The siege of Orléans is over. And from this point on, the French are on the offensive. Over the next 2 decades, they reclaim lost territory, push the English back, and by 1453, the 100 Years' War is effectively over. The English, once poised to take all of France, are left with only one lonely city: Calais. And Joan? Well, the English burned her at the stake, but history had the last word. She became a saint. Not bad for a teenage peasant girl. So why did the war last so long? Because it wasn't just one war. It was a series of conflicts, fueled by rival claims to the throne, political infighting, and sheer stubbornness. England won battles, but France outlasted them. And in the end, this war didn't just decide who ruled France. It helped shape modern warfare, ending the age of the knight and ushering the age of gunpowder and professional armies. Oh, and it also helped kickstart another war back in England. The Wars of the Roses. But that is another story. To a medieval peasant, seeing a knight in gleaming armour wasn't just an awe-inspiring sight. It was a stark reminder of the unshakable social order that ruled their world. Knights were elite warriors, trained from childhood, and armed with the best weapons money could buy. Peasants? They were too busy trying to keep their families fed to worry about swordplay. So, if these two were to face off in battle, the outcome should be obvious. Or is it? The medieval world was full of surprises. Like this simple tool, the agricultural flail. Designed to thresh grain and separate wheat from chaff, it seems harmless enough, right? Well, not exactly. With a few tweaks and a determined peasant wielding it, this everyday farm tool transforms into a devastating armor-crushing weapon. One that can bypass a knight's greatest defense, his plate armor. And that brings us to the real game changer, technology. A knight's armor was cutting edge for its time, making him nearly untouchable to traditional weapons. A sword? Useless. A spear? Might just skid off. But blunt force? Now that was a different story. But here's the catch. A knight wasn't just some helpless tin can waiting to be cracked open. He was a master of mounted combat, trained to outmaneuver, outthink, and, when needed, avoid battles he couldn't win. And let's not forget the sheer terror of facing down a fully armoured war machine thundering towards you on horseback. That alone was enough to make most peasants drop their pitchforks and run for the hills. Which is exactly why, when peasants did take on knights, they never fought alone. And in 1302 in Flanders, that's exactly what happened. At the time, its booming textile industry relied on importing high-quality wool from England. Officially, Flanders was a vassal of France, but its merchants had more in common with their English trading partners than their French overlords. The townspeople weren't just craftsmen and traders. They were ambitious, wealthy, and growing tired of French control. In the 1290s, Count Guy of Dampierre saw an opportunity. He tried to forge an alliance with England to loosen France's grip on his lands. But King Philip IV of France wasn't about to let that slide. His response? Invade Flanders in 1300, arrest the Count, and take full control. To cement his rule, Philip installed Jacques de Chatillon as governor. But this wasn't just about military occupation. It was about crushing the region's growing independence and bringing its wealth firmly under French royal control. But the Flemish towns had no interest in being ruled by a French governor who prioritized royal decrees over their livelihoods. Resentment simmered, until it finally boiled over into bloody revolution. In May 1302, Flemish rebels struck with deadly precision, massacring the French garrison in Bruges as they slept. What started as a single uprising quickly ignited into a full-blown rebellion, spreading like wildfire across Flanders. Overnight, France wasn't just dealing with unrest, it was facing an all-out revolution. But Philip wasn't about to let a band of rebellious townsfolk challenge his rule. He sent a massive army of elite knights under Robert II of Artois to crush the uprising once and for all. The French nobility rode into battle brimming with confidence. After all, what chance did a bunch of peasants and merchants have against the finest warriors in Europe? But this wasn't some disorganized mob. The Flemish militias were highly trained, fiercely disciplined, and armed with a brutal equalizer, the Hoedendag. Part spear, part club, this deceptively simple weapon was designed for one purpose: to stop a charging knight dead in his tracks. At the Battle of Kortrijk in 1302, the French knights charged in, expecting an easy slaughter. Instead, they ran headfirst into a brutal lesson. Even the best equipped, most highly trained knights could be defeated by peasants who knew how to fight back. The Annals of Ghent, a medieval chronicle, concludes its description of the battle. And so, by the disposition of God, who orders all things, the art of war, the flower of knighthood, with horses and chargers of the finest, fell before weavers, fullers, and the common folk and foot soldiers of Flanders. Albeit strong, manly, well-armed, courageous, and under expert leaders, the beauty and strength of that great French army was turned into a dung pit, and the glory of the French made dung and worms. In 1315, at the Battle of Morgarten, a ragtag force of Swiss peasants did the unthinkable. They crushed an army of elite Austrian knights. These weren't noble warriors in shining armor. They were farmers, shepherds, and mountain folk who refused to be ruled by the feudal elite. At the time, medieval warfare was built around open battlefields, where knights on horseback reigned supreme. The Habsburgs marched in with 2,000 knights and 7,000 infantry, fully expecting an easy victory over what they saw as a disorganized rabble. But they made one fatal mistake. They took the wrong road. Their army advanced through a narrow mountain pass near Morgarten, squeezed between steep slopes and the shores of Lake Egerie. Their cavalry, normally their greatest strength, was suddenly useless. And that's when the Swiss pounced. From the high ground of Mount Sattel, 1,500 lightly armed peasants turned the terrain itself into a weapon. They unleashed an avalanche of boulders and logs, shattering the tightly packed knights below. Then they charged, wielding halberds and pikes, slamming into the stunned and trapped Habsburg forces. They used speed, terrain, and brutal efficiency to turn the slow armored cavalry into sitting ducks. The result? A complete bloodbath. The once invincible knights were cut down, humiliated, and sent fleeing in panic. Morgarten wasn't just a battle, it was a wake-up call. The age of knights dominating the battlefield was coming to an end, and the rise of disciplined, well-trained militias had begun. Under the right conditions, with sheer numbers, smart tactics, and a battlefield that stripped knights of their advantage, a peasant could win. The trick? Flip the script. Turn the knight's greatest strengths into crippling weaknesses. Drag him into the mud, where his heavy armor becomes a prison. Funnel him into tight spaces, where his mighty warhorse is nothing but dead weight. Isolate him, slow him down, and suddenly, the unstoppable warrior of the Middle Ages becomes just another man, struggling to survive. So, could a lone peasant take down a fully armored knight? Not a chance. But a group of them, armed with nothing but determination, a few repurposed farm tools, and a clever grasp of battlefield tactics? History proves it's more than possible. And that's how a world built on the absolute power of armored cavalry was shattered by the very people it was meant to keep in line. Irony at its finest, don't you think? When you think of medieval warfare, you probably imagine knights in shining armor, banners fluttering in the wind, and the gallant charge of noble warriors. Hollywood has done a wonderful job of selling us that image. But the reality? Well, the reality was much closer to an absolute nightmare. The sights, sounds, and smells, none of them fit neatly into the romantic tales of chivalry. And if you're unlucky enough to find yourself on a medieval battlefield, your chances of survival? Let's just say you'd be better off taking up a career in alchemy. Medieval battles weren't neat, they weren't organised, and they certainly weren't fair. Most men who fought had little to no training. Weapons weren't always well maintained. And in medical care, let's just say that if you took a wound, you'd probably be seeing more of the afterlife than a doctor. So what did warfare really look like? And how did it change the world in ways you wouldn't expect? First, let's talk about the weapons. The sword gets all the glory, but in reality, the most effective weapons were often the least glamorous. Take the humble polearm pikes, halberds, and billhooks. Farmers used them to cut wood or butcher animals, and that's exactly what they did to enemy soldiers. These weapons were so effective that they made heavily armoured knights, who cost a fortune to train and equip, less valuable than a bunch of angry peasants with long sticks. A notable example is the Battle of Morgarten in 1315. During this conflict, Swiss forces employed halberds to devastating effect against Austrian knights. Contemporary chronicler Konrad Justinger described the scene. The Swiss held in their hands certain, most terrible murder weapons, known in the vernacular as Hellbarten, by means of which even the best armed opponents were cut apart as with a razor blade, and hacked to pieces. This brings us to the sword. Ah, the sword, the symbol of medieval combat, carried by kings, knights, and just about every hero in a fantasy novel. But how effective was it, really? Well, that depends. A well-made sword was a marvel of engineering, perfectly balanced, sharp enough to cut, and strong enough to thrust. But, and this is the important bit, it wasn't some magical weapon that could slice through armour like butter. In fact, against plate armour, a sword was about as useful as a butter knife. Knights had to aim for the gaps, under the arm, at the visor, behind the knee, if they wanted to do any real damage. If you were fighting someone in a full plate, you didn't try to slice them up like a roast chicken. Instead, you'd use a technique called half-swording, gripping the blade with one hand and using it like a short spear to thrust into weak points. Or you might just flip the sword around and use the pommel or crossguard to bludgeon your opponent into submission. So much for elegant dueling. And then there's this, arguably one of the most disruptive technologies of the medieval battlefield, the crossbow. This little device was so devastating that the Pope tried to ban its use against fellow Christians in 1139. Now, this wasn't about divine morality. After all, swords, axes, and maces were still fine. No, the real problem was that the crossbow threatened the social order. A peasant with one of these could kill a noble knight from 200 yards away with minimal training. Imagine the horror among the ruling class. A weapon that rendered their expensive armour and decades of training completely irrelevant. Not exactly the noble, hand-to-hand combat of legend. Speaking of the longbow, if you really wanted to deal death at a distance, it was king. And this wasn't just something anyone could pick up and use. You see, English law actually required men to practice archery every Sunday. From childhood, they'd build up the incredible strength needed to pull a longbow with a draw weight sometimes exceeding 150 pounds. That's the equivalent of pulling back a modern compound bow, twice. If you didn't practice, well, let's just say the local authorities wouldn't be too pleased. And the reason for all this archery practice? Because when war came, the king needed thousands of these highly trained archers ready to rain death on the enemy. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, English archers decimated the French nobility in a slaughter that reshaped the balance of power in Europe. Think about it. An army of commoners wiping out the aristocracy. That's not just a military victory, it's a shift in the entire social order. And then there's a problem of what happens after the battle. If you were wounded, your odds weren't great. Surgeons didn't have antiseptics, and infection was usually more deadly than the weapons themselves. In fact, battlefield medicine wouldn't make significant strides until centuries later. So, if you took an arrow to the leg, there was a good chance you'd end up having it removed with nothing more than a strong drink and a few men to hold you down. And if the wound festered, well, you'd be meeting your maker sooner rather than later. But let's say you survived the battle. Congratulations! Now you have to deal with the exhaustion, the hunger, the disease spreading through camp, and the very real possibility that your own commander might refuse to pay you. Because medieval warfare wasn't just about fighting, it was also about politics, economics, and sometimes plain old treachery. And then gunpowder arrived. This changed everything. By the late Middle Ages, cannons were smashing castle walls, and the first crude handguns were making armor obsolete. In just a few centuries, the armored knight would be a thing of the past, replaced by mass armies of gun-wielding infantry. And with that, medieval warfare as we knew it was over. So, next time you watch a Hollywood battle scene, remember this. Real medieval warfare wasn't about heroic duels or grand charges. It was brutal, messy, and often pointless. But it also shaped the world in ways you'd never expect, leading to new technologies, shifting power structures, and the slow, painful birth of the modern world. And in the end, isn't it fascinating how something so violent and chaotic could help build the civilization we live in today?